Vikram Oza. I've been a broadcast journalist for a couple of decades now, and most of the time I've been in a TV studio. From the time I started to now, it's really much easier to comb information from a variety of sources and get it across. What doesn't come across as easily sometimes is the how and the why of certain world events that we see unfolding around us. It's fair to ask, if you were attentive in history class that is, that the US and USSR were allies during the Second World War. So how did things go so sour between them? For that, here's a bit of rewind replay. The Second World War ends, Nazi Germany and the Axis powers get defeated. The United States and USSR are among the Allied powers emerging victorious. They are on the same side, and these two become the superpowers with their military might. But ideologically, they are poles apart. The US is a capitalist democracy, the USSR a communist dictatorship. These two nations have always been rivals who fear each other. While the USSR gets control of large areas of Eastern Europe, the US-led allies are in control of the West. While the allies restore democracy in their regions, the Soviet Union begins making these countries they are in control of as Soviet satellites. The split between these two is what we know as the Iron Curtain. In fact, the West-dominated world came to be known as the First World, and the USSR-dominated regions made up the Second World. That was the split. For about 40 years that the Cold War lasted, the West always feared a communist invasion, whether it was physical or ideological. They believed it would turn them into communist states with a Stalin-style leader. The president of the USSR back then, that's the Stalin I'm referring to, Joseph Stalin. To tackle that fear, the US starts working with the Truman Doctrine. It's named after US President Harry Truman. That policy is all about putting a stop to any kind of spread of communism in the world, which also means that the US goes all out supporting despots, insurgents, and other terrible, terrible regimes, just to keep the communists at bay. The US also has the Marshall Plan that has all these massive aid packages going out to support collapsing economies of the world. Economies that at the time are letting communist sympathizers gain power. Military alliances start getting formed as the West groups together as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the East bands together as the Warsaw Pact. Let me familiarize you with NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a military alliance of the capitalist West. It came together in the year 1949, and this happened after the Second World War, remember? There were only 12 member states at the time NATO was formed. Now there are 30. Its driving force is collective defense. It means that an attack on one member means an attack on all of them. But the more important aim, even back then when NATO was formed, was to fight back communist threat. The threat of the Soviets who were looking at expanding into Europe. The Soviet Union was the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, a collective of 15 member states, of which Ukraine was one, and of course so was Russia. Now, like Russia today, the USSR as a whole has always seen NATO as a big threat. So in 1955, the USSR formed its own counter-military alliance. The alliance was the coming together of East European communist countries like Poland, Romania, Hungary, and that formation was called the Warsaw Pact. So on the one side you had NATO, and the Warsaw Pact stood on the other side. So by 1951, Europe is divided into two power blocks, like I mentioned, the American-led one and the Soviet-led one, each with a huge stash of atomic weapons. The farthest the Soviet-led bloc makes it into Europe is East Germany, and that is the Cold War, spreading globally and leading to a nuclear standoff, the one that we remember as the Cuban Missile Crisis. But why is it called a Cold War? Well, simply because there was never really a direct military engagement between the United States and the USSR, with the exception of those shots that are fired in the air by both sides during the Korean War. But of course, all through the Cold War, there are plenty of proxy wars, there are conflict zones around the world between countries that were supporting either the US side or the USSR. And that's how the Iron Curtain came to be. On the east of the Iron Curtain were countries connected to or influenced by the Soviet Union. And on the west side were countries that were NATO members or nominally neutral. The Iron Curtain later became a term for that 7,000-kilometer long physical barrier of fences, of walls, of minefields and watchtowers, all of which divided the East from the West. Remember East Germany and West Germany? Yes, the Berlin Wall. That was also part of this physical barrier. That wall came up when the USSR issued an ultimatum demanding that all armed forces be withdrawn from Berlin, including the Western armed forces in West Berlin. And that led to the Berlin crisis. It ended with a wall, a partition wall that came up between East Berlin and West Berlin. And it went down in history as the Berlin Wall. But really, why is it an Iron Curtain? There's a little bit of trivia to this as well. What is the genesis of Iron Curtain? Iron Curtain was actually the fireproof curtain that was used in theaters. It would contain a fire lest it broke out on stage. Of course, it went on to become a lasting symbol of the Cold War. But there was a thaw in that Cold War, and it was a thaw of 15 years. This period was called the détente, when tensions eased up between the Soviet Union and the United States from the late 1960s to the year 1979. Both sides committed to reduce nuclear weapons as per the SALT negotiations, where SALT stood for Strategic Arms Limitation Talks Agreement. This was a 15-year period. It was a period of calm, and it ended when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, seemingly to fight off the Mujahideen there. With that, the new Cold War, the new Cold War started. This was a revival of tensions, of military build-ups, of back to the arms race, and fears of nuclear war, annihilation. The man to sweep it in was US President Ronald Reagan, who started supporting all these counter-insurgencies in the Third World. Reagan labeled the Soviet Union an evil empire. He predicted that communism would be left on the ash heap of history. Those were the words he used. And he wasn't really off the mark. Things weren't going well for communism ever since the Warsaw Pact, which of course, like I told you, is the NATO-style alliance of communist countries. Now, Warsaw Pact invades Czechoslovakia in 1968. That invasion was to clamp down reformist trends in Prague, reforms that went against communist ideology. While the invasion may have halted the pace of reform in Czechoslovakia, it led to the revolutions of 1989. Those revolutions brought down communist regimes in Poland, in Hungary, in East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, which pretty much ended the Warsaw Pact as we knew it. In fact, some of these states that had shed communism started aligning with US forces, and this was seen most when there was the fight to liberate Kuwait in the first Gulf War. So they actually went ahead and switched sides. And here is what probably set off the entire chain of events, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And this happened in the year 1990. It changed the entire world order. Yes, it reunited East and West Germany to make one country, but what is important to hear in this part of the entire flow of events is that it was an extension of West Germany that unified the two Germanys, not the other way around. The enlarged Federal Republic of Germany retained the West German seats in international organizations, whether you look at the European Union or the United Nations. On the other hand, East Germany's membership in the Warsaw Pact and many other international organizations to which East Germany belonged, it ended because East Germany itself did not exist anymore. And what was happening with the Soviet Union itself? Well, USSR President Mikhail Gorbachev brought in glasnost. Those were the reforms of openness and transparency in government dealings, and he brought in perestroika as well, the reformation of the Communist Party that ruled the USSR. This came at a time when the Soviet economy was in deep, deep trouble with the highest spends on defense. For decades, the United States and the Soviet Union had been competing with each other over who could amass the largest, most lethal cache of nuclear weapons. As the United States was developing the new Star Wars program, Gorbachev realized that the Soviet Union's economy was seriously suffering from the excessive spending that they made on nuclear weapons. To end the arms race, Gorbachev met several times with US President Ronald Reagan. At first, those meetings stagnated because trust between the two countries had been missing since the end of the Second World War. Eventually, though, Gorbachev and Reagan were able to work out a deal where not only would their countries stop making new nuclear weapons, they would actually eliminate many that they had accumulated over the period of the Cold War. Gorbachev brought in economic reforms. He brought in social and political reforms, like I mentioned, and he also had a very warm, honest, friendly, he had a very open demeanor, and that won him accolades from around the world, including the Nobel Peace Prize in the year 1990. Within USSR, though, his own country, there were many critics he had. For some, his reforms had been too big, too fast. Others saw his reforms as too small and too slow. But the truth is, Gorbachev's reforms did not revitalize the Soviet Union's economy, and that led to problems. On the contrary, the economy had taken such a severe downturn. The falling economy, the ability of citizens to criticize, the new political freedoms, all of these factors weakened the power of the Soviet Union. Soon, many Eastern Bloc countries, like I mentioned, they started abandoning communism, and many republics within the Soviet Union demanded their own independence. With the fall of the Soviet Empire then, in 1991, Gorbachev helped establish a new system of government, and that included the establishment of a president and the end of the Communist Party's monopoly as the only political party of the country. But for many, Gorbachev was going too far. So between August 19th and August 21st, 1991, a group of hardliners of the Communist Party attempted a coup, and they put Gorbachev under house arrest. The unsuccessful coup proved the end of both the Communist Party and the Soviet Union. Facing pressures from other groups who wanted more democratization, Gorbachev resigned from his post as president of the Soviet Union, and this took place on the 25th of December of 1991, a day before the Soviet Union officially dissolved. In that year, Boris Yeltsin was elected president of the Russian Soviet Federative Republic. You remember, it's a confluence of many states. He transformed Russia's command economy into a capitalist economy. That grew Russia's economic volatility, but it pushed up inflation also. And the economic shift, a small number of oligarchs emerged, and they obtained a majority of the national property and wealth in Russia. International monopolies came to dominate their market too. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin had become the prime minister of the government of the Russian Federation in August 1999. He took over as acting president when Boris Yeltsin sprung that dramatic surprise, turning in his resignation on the 31st of December. And he said that he was leaving the country in the able hands of this strong leader, his chosen successor, Vladimir Putin. Remember, Putin has been serving his fourth term as president of Russia. He's been in the highest office of the land since 2012 and earlier as well as prime minister under President Boris Yeltsin. This former KGB agent turned politician wants to be seen as a strong leader, and this to his own people and to the world as well. He wants Russia to be accepted as a superpower at par with the US. The West is resisting all those moves of Putin, and NATO's expansion in Eastern Europe is going on to anger Putin more and more. He claims that NATO promised the Russians in the 1990s that they would not move an inch towards the east. But many former Soviet states have joined NATO, and that's really the problem. Putin sees NATO as an extension of US power and inversely a reduction of Russian clout in the world. What is Putin really gunning for? With the Ukraine crisis, what does he hope to achieve? For one, Putin believes that Ukraine belongs to Russia and Ukrainians are Russians. His effort is a regime change in Ukraine so that it comes under his control with a compliant Ukrainian leader. For sure, Putin wants NATO to be out of the picture so that Russian borders are not threatened. By showing aggression in Ukraine, Putin is portraying himself as a strong leader before he runs for president again in the year 2024. You may recall that Putin has signed a new law in his country that has changed the constitution, and it would allow him to contest the elections for a third term. And it's not just to his own people that he wants to be seen as strong, remember. He wants the world to acknowledge this too. And this way, he wants to cement his place in world history. There's no doubt that Ukraine is a test of that leverage he has. In effect, he is putting Russian glory at the heart of it, putting psychological pressure to keep Ukraine from sliding to the West with a NATO membership. This undoubtedly is Putin's effort to shift the balance of power in Europe. By this time, the biggest concern is that a war between Russia and Ukraine could adversely affect the fragile global economy, which is already reeling under the debilitating impact of the pandemic. Not to take away the devastating loss of human life this could actually cause.